Hey, amazing people. If you're subscribed, then you're a legend. Thank you so much. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please smash that sub button and join the family. We're almost at 30,000 subs, so let's make that happen. It's free and really means a lot to us. Thank you so much. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoy these stories.
You won't hear a crazier catfish story than this one. I never thought meeting someone online would end up being the most awkward and bizarre experience of my life. I had met Danny through a mutual friend on a Discord server. They didn't know each other in person, just through Discord. She seemed cool, funny, chill, and super easy to talk to. After a few weeks of chatting, we discovered that we both lived in the same city. At first, it felt like a chance to hang out with a friend from the internet who wasn't too far away. Danny was always positive and outgoing in the chats, sharing memes and stories, making everyone laugh. I felt like we really clicked, and I figured meeting in person could be fun, maybe grab a coffee or just talk about whatever, like we did online. We agreed to meet up at a park near my place. It wasn't anything special, just a simple outdoor spot, but it seemed like the perfect setting for a casual hangout. I remember walking to the park that day, my phone buzzing with messages from Danny about how excited she was to finally meet. There was a part of me that was still a little nervous. It's always weird meeting someone from the internet, right? But at the same time, I figured we'd just vibe like we always did online. When I got to the park, I was scanning the area, trying to spot Danny. I didn't have a clear picture of what she looked like, but I was expecting someone who matched her online personality, maybe a little quirky, but still a girl who liked to joke around. I walked up to a bench, sat down, and started looking at my phone. As I glanced up, I saw someone walking toward me. The moment my eyes landed on them, my stomach dropped. The person walking towards me was not what I expected. At all. They were a man, not a woman like Danny's profile had suggested. He was significantly overweight, wearing an old, baggy t-shirt, and had a full beard. The worst part was the way he was walking toward me. There was a weird confidence in the way he carried himself, but his smile looked a little too eager, too forced. I stared at him for a second, trying to process what was happening. It was like my brain just couldn't register that this was the same person I had been chatting with for weeks. I didn't know what to do. I felt this rush of confusion flood over me, and before I even knew it, I was standing up. I couldn't say anything at first, just standing there staring at him like some kind of idiot. He gave me this awkward little wave, and I immediately felt embarrassed for myself. I didn't know if I was supposed to act normal or if I should just walk away. But the weirdest part, I just froze. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't get any words out. The man who called himself Danny, or rather Daniel now that I was seeing him, sat down beside me. He didn't seem to notice my discomfort, or if he did, he didn't care. He launched right into this weird, over-enthusiastic conversation about how he was happy to finally meet me, how he loved the park, and how he was excited to finally put a face to the name. Meanwhile, my stomach felt like it was twisting into knots, and I could feel my face going pale. The whole thing felt so off. This wasn't Danny. This wasn't who I thought I had been talking to. The more he talked, the more it hit me that everything he said sounded scripted, rehearsed, like he was trying way too hard to play the part of someone he wasn't. I kept looking at him, trying to understand what had happened. How was this the same person I'd been joking around with online? Someone who seemed so lively and fun. Then he said something that just completely broke me. He was talking about his work and how he loved it, and how he had been living this life online for years, and that he wasn't the person he used to be. At first, I thought he was talking about his job, but no, he meant something completely different. He went on to explain that everything in his life, all his photos, the personality he projected, were fake. He had been pretending to be someone he wasn't for so long that he didn't know how to stop. The photos, the online persona of Danny, the girl who was into cute stuff, who made everyone laugh. That was all part of a mask, a completely different person. The truth? He was Daniel, a guy who would have created this entire online character to get attention because he didn't feel good about who he was in real life. The moment he said that, I started feeling this wave of nausea wash over me. It wasn't just the fact that I had been nestled. It was the fact that he had spent all this time lying to me about something that wasn't real. I started thinking about every conversation we'd ever had and how none of it was genuine. Tanny, as I thought I knew her, wasn't even a real person. I felt this sick feeling crawling up my throat, and before I could stop myself, I turned away from him and had to run to a nearby trash can. I threw up. I didn't care if he saw. I couldn't keep it down. I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare, like everything I had believed in the last few weeks had been a lie. I wiped my mouth, my hands shaking as I stood there for a second, trying to compose myself. But I couldn't. I felt like I had been played for a fool. I wanted to just run, disappear from this moment. I turned back around, and Daniel was still sitting on the bench, looking at me with this weird mix of curiosity and regret. He didn't apologize or even acknowledge how completely messed up the situation was. At that moment, I realized that everything in the past few weeks had been a game for him. To get attention, to feel validated. But for me, it wasn't just disappointing, it was unsettling. How could someone go this far to fabricate an entire identity? To put on such an elaborate act and not even feel guilty about it? He wasn't just misleading people about his looks. He was misleading everyone about who he was. I didn't know what to say. Honestly, I didn't want to talk to him anymore. I turned around and walked away, trying to keep it together. I kept walking, not looking back, but I could feel his eyes on me, probably waiting for me to say something. I couldn't. The whole thing was just too much to process, too much to deal with. I never wanted to see Daniel again. It took a while for me to stop thinking about that moment. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of him sitting there, all of his fake bravado stripped away. The person I had been talking to wasn't real, and I couldn't believe how easily I had been fooled. I've met a lot of weird people online. This was next level deception. It made me question how well we can ever really know anyone, especially when everything we're seeing is a carefully crafted illusion. I had been chatting with Lily for a few weeks before we decided to meet up in person. I'll be honest, I was excited. She seemed really sweet online, funny, confident, and she had this energy about her that made me look forward to finally meeting her face to face. We decided to meet at a local coffee shop, which was perfect because it wasn't too fancy or too casual. Just a nice, chill place where we could talk without distractions. I checked out her photos a few times, and she seemed like my type: tall, slim blonde hair, with that perfect smile. Everything looked great. She'd been sending cute selfies and funny stories, and I had been looking forward to seeing her in person. It felt like everything was lining up just right. So I showed up a bit early, ordered a coffee, and I found a seat by the window. I was watching people walk by, checking my phone, and just waiting for her to arrive. I figured we'd get a drink, chat a bit, and see how it went. Then she walked in. I immediately froze. The girl standing in front of me didn't match the photos she had posted at all, not even close. My first thought was that she must have been someone else, but no, she was looking around, scanning the place like she was looking for me. And sure enough, when she made eye contact, she waved. The woman walking toward me was shorter, had dark hair, and looked a lot older than I expected. Not in a bad way. She didn't look bad at all, but it was just off. The confidence she exuded online wasn't there anymore. Instead, she seemed nervous, kind of fidgety, almost like she was apologizing before she even said anything. When she got to the table, she immediately started apologizing. She said she had used some old photos because she wanted to feel better about herself. I didn't really know how to react to that. It was one of those moments where I didn't know if I should laugh or just sit there in disbelief. I mean, we've all heard stories about people using older pictures, but to just walk in and admit it so casually was strange. She kept going on about how everyone on dating apps does the same thing, so it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal. I kept trying to smile, but I couldn't shake this feeling in the pit of my stomach. Everything felt off. She wasn't what I expected, and it wasn't just her appearance. It was like the energy shifted once she sat down. The vibe wasn't matching up with the person I'd been talking to for the past couple of weeks. It's one thing to change your look a bit with filters or angles, but when you show up completely different from how you present yourself online, it kind of feels like a betrayal. We sat there trying to talk, but the conversation felt forced. I'd ask her questions and she'd answer, but it always felt like she was just filling space, not really engaging the way she had in our chats. It's hard to explain, but it just wasn't the same. There was this underlying tension hanging between us. She kept apologizing for the photos, almost like she was waiting for me to say something to make her feel better, but it just wasn't clicking. I don't know why, but I kept thinking about how I was feeling, how I had started this date expecting one thing, and was now sitting across from someone who wasn't even close to what I thought I was getting. It was like the real person behind the screen was slowly unraveling in front of me, and I didn't know how to put the pieces back together. I tried to steer the conversation away from her apology about the photos, asking her about her job, what she liked to do for fun. But every time we touched on something personal, It just seemed like she was giving vague answers or quickly switching topics. She told me about her job in sales, but when I asked how long she had been there, she deflected. I asked her about her hobbies, and she gave me a vague answer about watching shows and going out with friends, but nothing that really stood out. It was clear to me at that point that something wasn't right. I started to wonder how much of what she said online was even true. Did she really have those qualities I've been talking to her about, or was it all just a persona she had built? And then it hit me. This wasn't just about the photos. This was about honesty. I mean, it's not just the fact that she showed up looking different. It was the fact that she didn't seem comfortable with herself, or maybe she was just hiding something else. It felt like the date was more about her justifying herself rather than being honest and real about who she was. After about 20 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I felt like I was just sitting there trying to make small talk with someone who wasn't really even there. I don't know how it happened, but I just said it. I think I'm going to head out. It wasn't a big dramatic exit, but I could tell she didn't expect it. She looked taken aback for a moment, but then she just nodded and told me that it was fine, that we could always try again sometime. But I didn't want to try again. I didn't even want to sit there for another second. I got up, paid for my coffee, and walked out without looking back. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I mean, yeah, the photos were misleading, but it wasn't just about that. It was about how she tried to cover up who she really was and make excuses for it, expecting me to just accept it. I didn't get it. Why couldn't she just be herself? Why did she think it was okay to present someone who wasn't even close to the person she was in real life? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the date, and honestly, I felt a little bit shaken. I felt like I had been duped, not just by the photos, but by the person I thought I was getting to know. It made me wonder how many other people out there are hiding behind fake versions of themselves, and how many times that kind of thing happens before you realize it's not just a simple mistake. It's a whole other person. I never reached out to Lily again. I didn't feel like there was any point. What I wanted was to meet someone who was real, who was comfortable being themselves, and that's not what I had just spent an hour with. Online dating can be weird enough without adding deception to the mix. People might think it's harmless to use old photos or exaggerate a little, but it's just not a good way to start something genuine. For me, that date was a lesson in trusting my gut, and my gut told me to walk away. I had been talking to this guy named Tom for over a month, and by the time we finally set a date to meet in person, I thought I already knew him pretty well. We'd shared all sorts of things, memories, interests, our thoughts on life, and even some really deep conversations. It felt like we had a solid connection. We talked about our favorite books, movies, and even traveled to some of the same places. He'd send me pictures of his trips and some shots of him hanging out with his family. He seemed like a really interesting guy, and I honestly couldn't wait to meet him. The pictures he sent were definitely a selling point. Tom looked like a guy who really took care of himself. He was fit, always smiling, with this youthful energy about him that made me think we'd vibe really well. He looked like the type who enjoyed hiking, spontaneous road trips, and always knew the best places to eat in town. He seemed charming and adventurous. So we made plans to meet at a cozy little cafe downtown, a place known for its chill atmosphere and great coffee. It seemed perfect. I got there early, grabbed a table by the window, and waited, thinking about how the conversation would flow once we were face to face. I kept checking my phone for messages, then glanced up when I saw someone walk in who looked vaguely familiar. I stood up, expecting to see the Tom I'd been chatting with for weeks, the guy with the good hair and bright smile. But this wasn't him. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was definitely something off. The man who walked toward me was shorter, at least 10 years older, and his hair, well, it was completely different from the one in his pictures. It was graying at the temples, and instead of the neat, modern style I'd seen, it was unkempt and messy, like it hadn't seen a comb in days. He wore a baggy button-up shirt that looked outdated and didn't really fit the trendy, well-put-together vibe I had expected. The jeans he wore were also just not it. I was staring at him trying to figure out how this was the same person, but then he smiled at me, and the look in his eyes was familiar. This was definitely Tom. He immediately started apologizing when he saw my face. "I'm really sorry about the photos," he said, almost like he'd been practicing the line. "They were taken years ago. I still feel young inside, though." I honestly didn't know what to say. I smiled awkwardly, trying to make sense of what was happening. I mean, everyone knows that people can look a little different in person, but this was not just a little different. This was like a whole different person. The man sitting in front of me wasn't the guy I had been talking to. The more I looked at him, the more uncomfortable I felt. I tried to stay polite, but the whole vibe was completely off. I kept thinking to myself, why would he lie about something as simple as his appearance? I wasn't expecting him to look exactly like his photos, but this was a straight up mismatch. The guy sitting across from me was older, scruffier, and just didn't have the same energy as the person I had been chatting with online. How could he think it was okay to send me pictures that didn't represent what he actually looked like? It wasn't like he looked bad, he just didn't look like the person I had gotten to know. As he continued to talk, I found myself zoning out a little. He was going on about his job, his love for travel, and how he stayed active in his free time. I nodded along, trying to stay engaged, but my brain kept wandering back to the images of him I had seen online. Why didn't he just be honest? I started feeling trapped, like I was stuck in this uncomfortable situation where I was forced to pretend everything was fine. He wasn't a bad guy, but he definitely wasn't the person I thought he was. The whole thing felt like a bait and switch. I kept wondering why he didn't think this would be a big deal. He had lied about something so simple. What else was he hiding? It wasn't just his appearance that made me uncomfortable, it was also his tone. He kept making these comments about how people always judge others by what they look like, and how that's why he never really took dating apps seriously. He said things like, it's not all the photos. It's about the connection you have with someone. It was almost like he was trying to convince me that his deception didn't matter. He even told me that I shouldn't judge a book by its cover, which, to be honest, felt like he was dismissing my discomfort altogether. I couldn't take it anymore. The more he talked, the more I realized this wasn't the person I wanted to get to know. I wasn't mad at him, but I was frustrated with the situation. It was clear to me that he had intentionally misrepresented himself, and I just couldn't get past it. I kept thinking about how, if he was willing to lie about something so obvious, what else was he hiding? How could I trust anything he told me? I excused myself early, not even bothering to finish my coffee. He tried to insist that we should at least hang out a little longer. As I walked out of the cafe, I kept replaying the whole thing in my head. The guy I had been talking to for the last month was not the guy sitting in front of me. The lies were small, but they felt bigger when I thought about them, like they were setting a tone for the rest of what could have been a potential relationship. I didn't know him at all, and I had no desire to get to know the person he was pretending to be. It was an odd feeling, though. I wasn't angry, I was just disappointed. I felt like I had been duped by someone who clearly didn't understand what it meant to be honest. I don't even think he realized how much that small lie about his appearance could affect everything else. I didn't hear from Tom again after that. I didn't bother to reach out either. Sometimes I think about him and wonder if he's still out there, lying to the next person who thinks they're meeting someone real. But honestly, I wasn't even mad. I was just glad I walked away when I did. The truth has a way of showing itself, even when people try to hide behind a fake version of who they really are. I'll be honest, I was excited when I matched with Emily on a dating app. We'd been talking for a few weeks, and from the start, I felt like we clicked. Our conversations were easy, and she seemed really down to earth. Her pictures were stunning. She had this natural beauty about her, a warm smile, and this effortless charm. She looked like someone I could really get to know, and I was starting to look forward to meeting her in person. We decided to meet at a local Italian restaurant. I arrived a little early and sat at a table by the window, my nerves tingling with anticipation. I didn't really know what to expect, but I had built up this mental image of what she would look like based on the photos she'd sent me. I imagined she'd be just as beautiful in person, if not more so. I checked my phone a few times, confirming the time and the place, just to make sure I didn't mess up. Then the door to the restaurant opened, and a woman walked in. I stood up, expecting to see Emily, but the person in front of me was not what I was expecting. The woman was a lot older than the photos, at least 5 or 6 years older, maybe more, and she was a lot heavier than the photos too. The girl in the pictures had been slim and fit, but this woman had a rounder face and a fuller figure. It wasn't that she was unattractive, but she definitely didn't look like the person I had been chatting with for weeks. She seemed to notice my hesitation as I looked at her, and she smiled nervously. "Hey," she said, a little awkwardly, and then immediately added, "Yeah, I know, not what you expected." She seemed almost embarrassed but wasn't really apologizing for the discrepancy. Instead, she just laughed and shrugged it off like it was no big deal. You know, everyone uses filters and angles, right? At that moment, I didn't know how to react. I smiled, but it was forced. The initial shock started wearing off, but it still felt awkward. I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to make the best of the situation. I mean, I wasn't going to walk out just because she didn't look exactly like her photos. But something inside me felt uneasy. It wasn't just a physical difference, but the way she seemed to brush it off as though it was no big deal. As though it was totally normal to misrepresent yourself online to that degree. We sat down and I tried to focus on the conversation, but everything felt off. She started telling me how she hadn't been very active on dating apps for a while and how she didn't realize how much things had changed. She went on to say that she hadn't been meeting anyone she really clicked with, and that she was just getting back into the swing of things. It felt like she was trying to justify her absence from the app, almost as if she was explaining away the reason why she'd used older photos to begin with. I kept thinking, why wouldn't she just be honest from the start? I mean, I didn't care if she wasn't exactly like her pictures. I cared more about the connection we were supposed to have. But it wasn't just the appearance that bothered me. It was the way she seemed to think it wasn't a big deal. Like, it wasn't even worth addressing. That's when I started feeling like I'd been tricked. Not just by her pictures, but by her whole approach to the situation. She hadn't told me the truth, and now she was acting like it wasn't a problem. The more she talked, the more awkward it got. I couldn't tell if she was just oblivious to how weird it all felt, or if she genuinely didn't care that she misrepresented herself. She mentioned that she didn't understand why everyone seemed so obsessed with appearance, and how she hated the pressure that came with it. I agreed with her on some points. Yeah, looks aren't everything when you're meeting someone for the first time. Isn't it kind of important to show who you really are? I wasn't expecting her to look like a model, but I did expect her to be honest about who she was. The conversation kept drifting, and I started zoning out a bit. I was trying to focus on her to be polite, but it was hard. She was still talking about how people on dating apps were all the same, judging based on looks, not really connecting, and I could feel myself growing frustrated. I was starting to think maybe she didn't even care about the connection. Maybe she just wanted to get something out of this whole thing, whatever that might be. At one point, she mentioned that she had been talking to a few other guys on the app, and how it had been going well, but it didn't sound like she was really invested in any of them. She seemed more casual about everything than I was comfortable with. And here I was sitting across from a person who had shown me a completely different version of herself online. I felt like I had been missiled, not just physically, but in the way she approached dating and relationships. I tried to steer the conversation to something lighter, something that could help me shake off the weird feeling in my stomach. I asked her about her job, her hobbies, things I've been curious about from our chats, but every time I tried to talk about something real, she just looped back into her justifications. It felt like she wasn't even aware that what she was doing was a problem. The more we talked, the more I realized that she wasn't really the person I thought she was. The genuine connection I thought we had started to feel forced. I couldn't sit through it much longer. The whole date felt like an exercise in pretending, and I just couldn't pretend anymore. I had tried to make the best of it, but I couldn't stop feeling like I was being deceived. I excused myself, cutting the date short. She seemed surprised, but not upset. I wasn't sure what to say to her, so I just thanked her for coming and told her I had to go. As I walked out of the restaurant, I couldn't help but feel like I had been part of some kind of weird social experiment. The whole thing just felt wrong. The next day, I didn't text her. I didn't know what to say, and honestly, I didn't want to continue a conversation with someone who felt like honesty didn't matter. It wasn't just the pictures. It was the way she didn't seem to think it was a big deal. I think that was what bothered me the most. It wasn't the physical difference. It was the fact that she thought it was okay to mislead someone. And that's when I realized I don't think I could trust her, no matter how many more conversations we had. I've been on a few dates since then, and I've learned to be more careful about who I'm talking to, and more importantly, to trust my gut. Because no matter how many filters and angles you use, the truth always has a way of showing up, even if it takes a little longer than expected. I've been talking to Claire online for what felt like ages. We spent weeks texting, sending memes, and talking about everything from our favorite movies to the random stuff that always makes you laugh late at night. She was smart, funny, and from the photos she shared, incredibly attractive. It felt like we had a connection from the get-go. After what seemed like a solid build-up, We finally agreed to meet in person. We picked a coffee shop in the city, one of those quiet places with comfy chairs and lots of plants. It seemed like a great spot for a first date, low-key, but still a little cute. The morning of the date, I was actually pretty excited. I had never met someone I clicked with so easily. I kept thinking about how we would probably have a great time and maybe even get a second date. After all, she'd sent pictures that made her look like the kind of woman I could see myself with. Plus, our conversations had been easy, and I felt that we were building something real. So when I walked into the coffee shop, I expected to see her sitting at one of the tables, probably typing on her phone or reading a book. But when I scanned the room, I didn't see her right away. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and that's when she walked in. It took me a second to even register that it was her. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the one from the pictures. She was different, way different. It's hard to describe, but the first thing that hit me was how much older she looked. She looked about 50 pounds heavier than her photos, her features weren't quite the same, and her hair was a different shade entirely. The Claire from the photos had this effortless beauty, glamorous but natural. This Claire looked like someone who had been through a lot more than she was letting on. I was taken aback. I tried to hide it, but I'm sure the shock showed on my face. I had to do a double take just to make sure I was looking at the right person. As soon as she saw me, she gave me this tight smile and immediately apologized. She said the pictures she'd sent me were from a few years ago, that she was going through a rough time and didn't look like that anymore. It was weird hearing her say it, but at that point, I figured maybe it was just a slight exaggeration. Maybe I was just thrown off by the fact that she didn't look like the photos. But the more she talked, the more it started to feel off. We sat down, and I was trying to process what had just happened. I wasn't angry, but I definitely felt uncomfortable. I wasn't mad that she didn't look like her photos, but the fact that she had misled me felt like a punch to the gut. It was like she'd built an entire version of herself that didn't exist, and now was sitting there with someone who felt like a stranger. But then it took a darker turn. As we sat down and started talking, Claire casually admitted something that made my stomach drop. She told me that she had been using other people's photos and identities online to attract men. She said she'd been doing it for a while, and that she didn't feel like she was good enough as herself. It was almost like she was trying to justify it. She said it with this strange, almost prideful tone, like it was a strategy she had perfected. She explained that in her mind, the only way she could get attention was by pretending to be someone else. It was heartbreaking in a way, but also incredibly disturbing. It wasn't just that she had lied to me. She was straight up admitting to a pattern of deception. And as she kept talking, I started to feel like I was part of some kind of sick game. The more she revealed, the more uncomfortable I felt. It got worse when she started talking about how she never felt good enough about herself. She said she wasn't even sure if she was worthy of love, and that she used these fake profiles to get validation from strangers. It sounded like a cry for help, but it also felt manipulative. The more I listened to her, the more I realized how deep her insecurities went. It's not that I didn't feel sorry for her. It's that she seemed to be trying to use me as a part of her emotional manipulation. As the date went on, she became more intense, and her tone shifted. She started telling me how she could give me everything I needed, how she could be exactly what I wanted. I don't know how to explain it, but it started to feel less like a conversation and more like a heavy emotional demand. She looked at me with these wide, pleading eyes and said that no one would ever love me the way she could. There was something in her voice that made my heart race, but not in a good way. It was like she was trying to convince me that I needed her, that I wouldn't find someone like her, and that I should be grateful for the chance to be with someone who understood me so well. It was manipulative, and it made my skin crawl. I started to feel trapped. I wanted to leave, but I wasn't sure how to get away from her. She had grabbed my arm at some point, holding me in place, telling me not to go. I tried to pull my arm free, but she gripped it tighter, her voice almost pleading now. She said things like, "You'll never find someone like me, and you don't even know what you're leaving behind." It was like she was a different person, someone who couldn't take no for an answer. It wasn't just a bad date at this point. It felt like she was trying to control the situation, to make me feel like I was obligated to stay in and give her a chance. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was suffocating in the moment. I finally broke free, standing up and moving towards the door. I told her I couldn't do this, but she kept trying to stop me, giving me these desperate looks. I ended up leaving the cafe, my mind racing the entire walk back to my car. It felt like I had just stepped out of a nightmare. The worst part wasn't the photos or her lies. It was the emotional manipulation. I felt like I had just experienced something dark and unsettling, and it was hard to shake. I couldn't stop thinking about how she had used her insecurities as a weapon, trying to force me into something I didn't want. I haven't heard from her since that night, and honestly, I don't want to. The whole situation left me questioning how far people would go to make others feel sorry for them, or how much they were willing to manipulate someone for their own validation. It was a wake-up call. Sometimes the people we meet online aren't who they say they are. And sometimes the worst lies aren't about what you look like, but about who you claim to be. I had been chatting with Jason for a few weeks before we finally decided to meet in person. He was a friend, and everything seemed to check out. His social media was full of photos that made him look like the kind of guy you'd see on a travel blog. Well-traveled, athletic, always smiling, surrounded by beautiful landscapes and fit friends. I mean, if I had to guess, he was the type of guy women would flock to. He looked like he had his life together in every way. And after all those messages back and forth, I was actually kind of excited to meet him in real life. We agreed to meet at this quiet little cafe downtown. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was cozy. A good spot for a casual first date, or so I thought. I showed a little early, grabbed a table by the window, and tried to relax. The place was packed, and it had that warm coffee shop vibe where you could hear the clinking of mugs and the low hum of conversation. I checked my phone and saw that Jason had messaged me saying he was on his way. I couldn't wait to finally meet him face to face. When he walked in, I immediately felt my stomach twist. This wasn't the guy from the pictures, not even close. I almost didn't recognize him, and I tried not to show my surprise. The guy who walked up to me was older, probably at least 20 years older than the guy in the photos. He had acne scars all over his face, and his clothes were wrinkled, like he hadn't bothered to put in any effort to look nice. His hair was thin, and he had this kind of slouched posture that made him look even older. It wasn't just a little off from the photos, it was a completely different person. He sat down without any acknowledgement of the fact that he looked nothing like the man in the pictures. I felt a little thrown off, but I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just having an off day, right? But then, as I sat there trying to figure out how to approach the situation, he said something that left me speechless. He didn't apologize. He didn't seem embarrassed at all. Instead, he casually mentioned that the pictures he had been using were actually of his younger brother. The guy in the photos wasn't even him. It was his brother, someone who was a solid 15 to 20 years younger, fitter, and better looking. Jason then proceeded to explain that he had been using his brother's photos to market himself because he didn't like the way he looked anymore. At that point, I felt a cold wave of confusion. I mean, I had to have heard him wrong, right? But no, he kept going. He said he didn't want anyone to see the real him. He claimed that he used his brother's photos because it was the only way to get women interested in him. He went on about how he had tried dating without using fake photos, but it hadn't worked, and now he was just trying to make the most of the cards he was dealt. He sounded almost proud of it. I tried to stay calm. I kept thinking that maybe I was misunderstanding him. Maybe there was some deeper issue here that I didn't understand. But honestly, the more he talked, the more uncomfortable I became. I mean, what kind of person does that? Why would you lie so blatantly about something that seems so important? I couldn't wrap my head around it. I wasn't even sure if he was trying to explain himself, or if he genuinely believed what he was saying was okay. But it wasn't just the deception that bothered me. It was the way he said it, like it was all no big deal, as if this was just something everyone did, and I should just get over it. He didn't seem sorry or even remotely concerned about the fact that he had misled me. In fact, he seemed kind of proud that he had played the game so well. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't a guy who felt bad about lying to people. This was a guy who felt entitled to deceive others if it meant getting what he wanted. I started thinking about how I should handle it. I couldn't stay there for much longer. This whole situation was messed up. I was sitting across from someone who was pretending to be someone else entirely, and it felt like I had just walked into a trap. When I told him I was going to leave, he didn't take it well. His expression changed, and for a second I thought he was joking. But then he started to get more insistent. He said that I shouldn't just judge him for what he'd done. He told me I needed to give him a chance because he deserved love too. His voice became more forceful, and I could see his frustration building. It was like he wasn't taking no for an answer. This wasn't just a bad date anymore. It felt like emotional manipulation. He even grabbed my arm when I tried to stand up, and that's when I really started to panic. He was telling me that I couldn't just walk away, that I needed to see him for who he really was. It felt like he was trying to trap me and make me feel guilty for leaving him after all the effort he had put into selling himself to me. It was honestly terrifying. I yanked my arm away from him and quickly stood up, my heart racing. He kept trying to hold on to me, asking me to stay, demanding that I at least give him a chance. But it felt like a game to him, a game of emotional manipulation, and I wasn't having any of it. I didn't even look back as I walked out of the cafe. I didn't care how he felt at that point. All I could think about was getting as far away from him as possible. The whole experience left me feeling a mix of disgust and confusion. It wasn't just that he had lied about his appearance. It was the way he had tried to twist the situation into something where I felt like I owed him something, just because he had given me a chance. I felt manipulated, like I was some sort of pawn in his messed up game. I've never heard from Jason again, and I don't plan on ever seeing him again. I've met a lot of people in my life, but I've never had a first date like that. It was a kind of experience that made me seriously question what people will do to get attention, how easily someone can try to manipulate you into feeling responsible for their actions. It wasn't just a bad date, it was a nightmare. It's funny how you can think you know someone after a few weeks of texting, like you really get a feel for their personality. That's what happened with Eric. I matched with him on a dating app, and at first, everything seemed perfect. His profile was full of pictures from exotic vacations, showing him surrounded by friends, smiling in front of stunning backdrops. He looked like someone who had their life together. He had the perfect mix of adventure and charm, the kind of guy I thought I'd really get along with. After a few weeks of messages, we decided to meet up in person. He suggested this small cafe near the beach. Nothing too fancy, just a cozy spot with a view of the ocean. I was actually excited. We had so much in common. We both loved hiking, had an appreciation for good food, and enjoyed the same kind of humor. Everything about our chats had felt so natural, and I was really looking forward to seeing if the chemistry in person was just as good. But the moment I saw him, something felt off. He wasn't anything like the guy in his photos. I mean, not even close. The guy who walked in was much heavier than the pictures he posted, sweat beading on his forehead as though he had just run a marathon. His hair was messy, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been picked out with any care. He immediately apologized for his appearance, explaining that he'd recently had surgery and had gained some weight. It seemed like a reasonable excuse at the time, so I nodded, trying not to stare at the obvious difference between the man in front of me and the guy I had been talking to. But things just didn't add up. The more I sat there trying to make small talk, the more uncomfortable I became. The awkward silence between us was unbearable, and I couldn't stop looking at him, trying to figure out what was wrong. His eyes didn't have the same spark that I saw in his pictures. He was fidgeting, wiping his hands on his pants. It felt like he was trying too hard to convince me that everything was fine. But then, after a few minutes of us just sitting there in a weird silence, he dropped a bombshell. He wasn't Eric. The guy sitting across from me wasn't the same person whose pictures I had been talking to for weeks. He had stolen Eric's identity. He explained, in a tone that made my stomach flip, that the profile I had been chatting with belonged to a completely different man, a guy named Eric who had no idea he was being impersonated. The man sitting in front of me wasn't even the person I thought he was. At that moment, I felt like the ground beneath me had shifted. I wanted to laugh, thinking this was some kind of joke, but his face was serious, almost pleading. He went on to explain that he had done this before, not just to me, but to other women. He created a fake profile using someone else's pictures and life story to lure women in. When I asked him why, his answer was simple. He couldn't face the real him. He thought no woman would ever give him the time of day if they saw him for who he really was. He said he felt like a failure, and pretending to be someone else made him feel better, at least for a while. The whole thing made my skin crawl. I couldn't even look at him at that point. I couldn't understand how someone could go to such lengths to deceive others. The fact that he had done it repeatedly made it even worse. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern of behavior, something he had perfected in order to feel better about himself. Then he dropped the real kicker. He had made up the whole surgery story too. He hadn't had surgery, and the weight gain wasn't due to any medical condition. It was just an excuse, a cover-up for his real appearance, which he said he was deeply ashamed of. He admitted that he felt ugly, that he hated how he looked, and that he didn't want anyone to see the real him. It was like he had crafted this entire narrative to make himself more appealing, but none of it was real. At this point, I was just in shock. I didn't know what to say. I felt disgusted, betrayed even, and a little bit trapped. I had been talking to a stranger this whole time. Everything we had shared, all the laughs and the deep conversations, was built on lies. I wanted to just get up and walk out, but then he started pleading with me. He begged me to stay to give him a chance. He said it wasn't his fault he was ugly and that real love sees beyond looks. He even started talking about how he just wanted to be loved, how he had been rejected his whole life, and how this was the only way he could get someone to notice him. It felt like emotional manipulation, and I started to feel trapped. He wasn't apologizing or showing any remorse for what he had done. Instead, he was trying to make me feel bad for him, like I should somehow excuse his behavior because of how he felt about himself. It was disturbing, almost like I wasn't dealing with a person, but with someone who was playing some sort of twisted emotional game. It wasn't about honesty or connection anymore. It was about him using my sympathy to manipulate me into staying. It made me sick to my stomach. I excused myself as quickly as I could, telling him I had to go. He didn't try to stop me physically, but he kept telling me that I couldn't just leave, that I owed him a chance. I didn't respond. I just grabbed my bag and walked out of the cafe. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The walk back to my car felt like a blur. My heart was still racing, and I kept replaying the whole encounter in my head, trying to make sense of it. How did I not see it? How did I get so caught up in this guy's web of lies? I hadn't even noticed how deeply manipulative he was until it was almost too late. I didn't hear from him again, and honestly, I'm glad I didn't. I blocked him on everything, and I tried to move on, but that date still haunts me. It wasn't just the fact that he lied about his identity. It was how he tried to manipulate me into feeling responsible for his actions. It was like I wasn't on a date at all, but part of his twisted attempt to find validation, no matter the cost. That's not love, and it sure as hell isn't the kind of person I want in my life. I'm thankful that I had the strength to walk away. But I'll never forget the feeling of being deceived on that first date. It wasn't just a bad date. It was a nightmare that I'll never forget. I thought I was about to meet the woman of my dreams. It's crazy how fast we connected. I met Ashley through a friend who raved about her, saying she was this incredibly beautiful and fun person. When I looked at her profile, her photos were like something out of a magazine. Glamorous shots of her at parties, hanging out with celebrities, and traveling to these exotic locations. She looked like she had everything together, exactly the type of woman I imagined I'd get along with. We'd been chatting online for a few weeks. She was funny, smart, and seemed so down to earth in our messages. After a while, we decided to meet in person. She suggested a coffee shop downtown. I remember walking there, feeling kind of excited and a little nervous, just hoping she would be as great in person as she was over text. But when she walked in, I was completely caught off guard. The woman in front of me didn't look anything like the person in her photos. Not even close. I mean, it wasn't even a minor difference. She was much older, thinner, and had a completely different face. Her skin was much more wrinkled than I expected, and there was a noticeable weariness about her. The woman I had been talking to online had this fresh, youthful energy in her photos, but this was something completely different. I was stunned, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe there was an explanation for this. Maybe she had gone through some tough stuff recently, and she didn't look like her photos because of that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She could tell I was taken aback, and I watched her face turn a little red, almost embarrassed. She immediately apologized, saying something along the lines of how she had been using old pictures because she felt like no one would want her if she showed her real self. Okay, that was uncomfortable to say the least. But it wasn't just the fact that she used old pictures that bothered me. People do that all the time, right? Maybe not to this extreme, but sometimes people post older, better-looking photos of themselves. I tried to let it slide, thinking I could just focus on the conversation and see if we still clicked in person. After all, looks aren't everything, right? But then things took a really weird turn. She leaned in a little, like she was about to tell me something important, and then she dropped the bombshell. "I'm not even using my real name," she said, almost casually, like it was no big deal. I remember blinking and just staring at her, trying to process what she had just said. At first, I thought maybe I misheard her, but she kept going. She said that the photos she had posted online didn't belong to her either. The woman in those pictures was someone she had met a few years ago at a beauty pageant, a woman who, by all accounts, was stunning. And for some reason, Ashley had decided to use her photos and even her name to create a completely fake identity. That was when everything started feeling really off. I didn't know what to say. I mean, she wasn't even pretending to be someone close to her or even a version of herself that she felt good about. She had created an entirely different person, a person who wasn't real, and that person had apparently been a hit with guys. At least, that's what she said. It hit me like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just using old photos to hide the passage of time. She was literally pretending to be someone else, using someone else's life and looks to get attention. I didn't know if I should be angry or just horrified. How could someone think that was okay? But wait, it got worse. She didn't even sound guilty or remorseful about any of it. No apology, no sign of regret. She went on to tell me that she had done this to several guys before. She even casually mentioned how easy it was to get validation when you were pretending to be someone else. She said that when men were attracted to her fake persona, it made her feel good, like she was finally wanted. She even admitted that it was easier to get attention from men under someone else's name because, in her mind, the real her was unlovable. It was all just so disturbing. The fact that she didn't feel any guilt, that she had done this to more than one person, and the way she casually justified it all, it made me sick to my stomach. She made it sound like it was just part of the game of dating, that this kind of deception was just something you had to do in order to win. She didn't see it as lying or manipulating, she just thought it was normal. She even said that when men saw her real self, they'd lose interest, so what was the point of showing them the truth? That's when I realized I was sitting across from a complete stranger. None of the person I had been talking to for weeks was real. She wasn't who she said she was, and I felt completely fooled. I don't know why, but I stayed for a few more minutes. I guess I was just trying to process what was happening. I kept thinking maybe I misunderstood her or that it was some kind of joke, but no, she was dead serious. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. She had used someone else's identity for her own benefit, and I couldn't believe I had fallen for it. I felt like she had played me for a fool. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked out. There was no way I was going to sit through any more of that. As I walked out of the cafe, I couldn't stop shaking my head. How did I even get here? How could anyone do that to another person? The whole thing left me feeling so disgusted. I thought I'd met someone real, someone I could connect with, but it was all a lie. I guess I learned the hard way that just because someone looks perfect on paper or on a screen doesn't mean they are. And honestly, it wasn't just the fact that she used fake pictures. It was the fact that she was so completely unapologetic about it, like it was just part of the dating game. When I left that cafe, I felt a weird mix of relief and disbelief. I mean, I had dodged a huge bullet, but the whole experience left me questioning just how far people are willing to go to deceive others in the name of validation. I've always been pretty skeptical about online dating, but after a few bad experiences, I figured I'd give it one more shot. That's when I met Jake. He seemed like the kind of guy I connect with. He had a great job in finance, went on these amazing vacations, and had the type of photos that made him look like he belonged in a magazine. You know the ones, dressed to the nines at fancy dinners, lounging by beautiful beach resorts, smiling like he was living the dream. I didn't really think twice about him, to be honest. He checked all boxes. We spent a few weeks chatting online, and the more we talked, the more he seemed like the total package. He was charming, funny, and had a way of making you feel like you were the only one in the conversation. I thought I had finally found someone who was genuine. When we'd agreed to meet in person, I was actually excited. I'd been looking forward to seeing him. We planned to meet at a quiet little cafe, somewhere public, but still cozy enough to have a good conversation. When I walked in and saw him, though, I froze. The man who greeted me was completely unrecognizable. Gone were the sharp jawline and the picture-perfect physique he'd flaunted in his profile photos. Instead, I was staring at a man in his 40s with a noticeable paunch and a tired, worn-out look about him. He was dressed in a button-up shirt that didn't fit him well, kind of baggy around the middle, and some wrinkled pants that made him look even older than his profile picture suggested. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it definitely wasn't this. He looked nothing like the guy I had spent weeks chatting with. I couldn't help it. My stomach sank. I tried to keep my composure as he waved me over to the table, but I wasn't sure if I was more shocked or disappointed. Either way, I wasn't sure how to handle it. I sat down across from him, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He didn't seem embarrassed, not even a little bit. In fact, he barely even acknowledged the glaring difference between the photos and the man sitting in front of me. Instead, he shrugged it off like it was no big deal and said something along the lines of, I haven't updated my profile in a while. You can't expect me to look like that forever. It was the way he said it that threw me off. He didn't seem apologetic or like he even cared that he misrepresented himself. It was like he thought it was normal, maybe even justified, to lie about something as big as his appearance. The conversation started off awkwardly, and I tried to push through it. But it didn't take long before I realized he wasn't really interested in having a normal conversation. He kept talking about how successful he was, throwing around numbers and names of companies like he was trying to impress me. But honestly, it felt like he was trying to convince himself of something, not me. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to ask him, Jake, what happened? Your profile, those pictures, they don't look anything like you. He laughed, not a nervous, awkward laugh, but a full-on chuckle like he thought it was the funniest thing in the world. Its response, you should feel lucky to be in my presence. I'm doing you a favor, honestly. What? I stared at him, unsure if he was serious or if I had somehow stepped into some bizarre alternate reality. This man, who I had been chatting with for weeks, who seemed so down-to-earth online, was now sitting in front of me, acting like he was doing me a favor by showing up. The whole thing was messed up. I didn't know how to react. I felt like I was in some kind of twisted game, and I wasn't sure if I was a pawn of the joke. My stomach turned at the thought of him not only lying about his appearance, but also thinking he was superior in some weird way. His arrogance was overwhelming, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. As we sat there, the conversation became increasingly uncomfortable. He kept saying things that made my skin crawl. He was condescending, borderline dismissive, and completely oblivious to how weird he was acting. I remember him going on about how he had the right to change his look, as if it were some kind of justification for the false persona he had built. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't just the fact that he had lied about his appearance. That alone would have been bad enough. It was how he completely disregarded the fact that he was disrespecting me, that I had trusted him, and that I had been genuinely excited to meet him. I knew I couldn't sit through this much longer. My mind was racing, and all I wanted to do was get out of there. But it was like he was playing some sick game, feeding off my discomfort. He seemed to take some twisted pride in the fact that I was uncomfortable. At one point, I just had to speak up. Jake, this isn't working. I'm not comfortable with how this is going. I think I should go. Instead of reacting with embarrassment or regret, he just looked at me like I was the one in the wrong. He leaned back in his chair, almost smugly, like I was some kind of inconvenience. You sure you want to leave? I mean, I'm not just going to chase you down. If you don't see what I'm offering, that's on you. I had never been more repulsed in my life. I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't just his appearance, or the fact that he lied. It was a whole attitude, this air of entitlement that he wore like a badge of honor. I stood up, paid for my coffee, and left without looking back. As I walked out of that cafe, I felt a weird mix of anger and relief. Anger that he had been so deceptive and entitled, but relief that I was finally free from the nightmare that date turned into. I realized something that I should have known all along. Sometimes the pictures aren't the only thing that's fake. What's worse is when someone truly believes they can manipulate you into thinking they're someone else entirely, and then act like you're the problem for not buying into their lies. I've never been one to put too much stock into online dating, but after a while, I figured I'd give it another shot. I was talking to a girl named Mia for a few weeks. Her photos were like something out of a magazine. Glamorous, confident, always out having fun, looking like the kind of person who was always on the go. She posted pics from what looked like a bunch of parties, beach trips, and dinners with friends. Honestly, she seemed perfect. We had some great conversations too. She was witty, smart, and kept me on my toes. After a few weeks of texting back and forth, we agreed to meet in person. I was really looking forward to it, but something wasn't right. I mean, you see someone online, and it's easy to get attached to the idea of them, especially when they seem so perfect. But when I actually showed up at the cafe where we were meeting, it hit me like a ton of bricks. The woman who walked in didn't look anything like the Mia I had been talking to. She was still cute, but that confident, glamorous vibe was totally gone. She was much heavier than the photos, and there was a visible awkwardness about her, like she didn't quite know how to hold herself. She wasn't that same woman from the pictures who looked like she had it all together. The woman in front of me looked nervous, reserved, and like she was trying to hide behind a mask of forced confidence. I won't lie, I was taken aback. I mean, I knew people didn't always look the same as their photos, but this felt different. I tried to keep it cool though, because maybe she had a valid explanation. She immediately apologized, explaining that she'd been dealing with some health issues lately and that she wasn't at her best. She told me that she was still the same person though, and while I could feel a bit of sympathy for her, something about the whole situation just felt off. I was expecting to meet the confident, fun, adventurous Mia I'd seen online, and instead, I was sitting across from a completely different person. I tried to brush it off, but the more we talked, the weirder it got. We started chatting, but the conversation quickly shifted. Mia seemed obsessed with trying to get me to feel guilty about not liking her as much now that I saw her in person. She kept bringing up how she knew I would never have been interested in her if I'd known the truth beforehand. I wasn't sure what to say to that, and it made me feel really uncomfortable. She kept going on about how she wasn't the woman in the pictures, and that I shouldn't judge her because of it. I tried to tell her that I wasn't judging her, but she wouldn't drop it. It felt like she was setting me up to say something wrong. She was practically guilt-tripping me, making me feel like a terrible person for not just accepting her immediately, no questions asked. I started to feel like I was being manipulated, like I couldn't even think without feeling bad about it. The whole mood shifted, and suddenly I wasn't sitting with someone who I was enjoying getting to know. I was stuck in some weird emotional game where she was playing the victim and trying to make me feel like I owed her something for being there. It was confusing. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how to do it without making things worse. As the night went on, things got worse. Mia got quieter and more withdrawn, and every time I tried to change the subject, she'd loop it right back to how I was probably disappointed by her. I felt trapped, honestly. It was like I was stuck in this conversation where I had to keep reassuring her that I wasn't disappointed. But at the same time, I was uncomfortable with how much she was pushing me to feel guilty for something that had nothing to do with me. It wasn't about how she looked, it was about how she was making me feel like I was doing something wrong for being surprised. Then came the part that really made my stomach turn. The date was winding down, and I was just about ready to head home. I'd had enough, but Mia suddenly turned on me. She asked me to walk her home. I agreed, not really sure why, but it felt like I couldn't say no. I wasn't really sure what to do at this point, so I figured just getting out of there as quickly as possible was the best option. But that wasn't the worst part. As we walked, Mia started crying, like really crying. She told me that if I didn't walk her all the way home, she was going to be alone forever, and that no one else would ever love her. It felt like she was trying to emotionally manipulate me into doing something I didn't want to do. She was crying, and it was so over the top that I was honestly freaked out. I didn't know if I should console her or just walk away. I had never been in a situation like this before, and the pressure she was putting on me to comfort her was intense. I didn't know what to do. I tried to distance myself a bit, but she kept holding onto my arm and crying, and the whole thing felt like I was being suffocated by her emotions. I was already uncomfortable enough with the fact that she didn't look anything like the woman I'd been talking to online, but now she was twisting it into this bizarre emotional blackmail. It felt like I couldn't win no matter what. Eventually, I found a way to get out of the situation without making it worse. I ended the walk as quickly as possible, telling her I had to leave. She seemed to understand but gave me one last tearful plea, asking me not to forget her. It was creepy, like she was trying to latch onto me as her lifeline, and I didn't know how to shake her off. I made my way back home, and honestly, I couldn't stop thinking about the whole night. I had never been guilt-tripped so much in my life. It felt like everything about that night was a manipulation tactic, like she was trying to get me to feel bad for something that wasn't my fault, and the whole thing made me feel sick. The worst part, I didn't even know how to handle it. I didn't know how to walk away without feeling like I was abandoning her or being mean. It was just such an emotionally draining experience. I was glad it was over, but I couldn't help but feel like I had somehow just gotten tangled up in something that I wasn't prepared for. The whole thing was so messed up. I was chatting with this girl named Sable for a few weeks, and honestly, she seemed too good to be true. Her photos were like something out of an influencer's feed, always in amazing places laughing with friends, looking like she had her life completely together. We exchanged messages every day, and I started getting this feeling that maybe, just maybe, I found someone who was genuine and fun. After weeks of online flirting and texting, we finally decided to meet up in person. I'll be honest, I was excited. I thought meeting her in real life was going to be like hitting the jackpot. But from the second she walked into the coffee shop, I knew something was off. I didn't even recognize her at first. The girl standing in front of me was much shorter than I expected, much heavier in her energy. It was completely different from the vibe I had gotten over text. She wasn't the bubbly, confident girl I'd seen in her pictures. Instead, she was quiet, almost awkward. The smile on her face felt forced, and there was this weird emptiness in her eyes. I tried to be polite, you know. I didn't want to judge right away, but I couldn't ignore the fact that she looked nothing like the girl I had been talking to. I figured maybe it was just the nerves. People sometimes act a little different when meeting someone in person for the first time. So I asked her about the usual stuff, what she'd been up to lately, what she liked to do in her free time, but it was clear she wasn't really into the conversation. Her answers were short, almost like she didn't want to be there. And then, after a few awkward silences, she said something that totally threw me off. She smiled a little, like she knew she had to explain, and casually mentioned that she didn't look like her photos, but that the person in those pictures was her best self, not who she was now. At first, I didn't really know how to respond. I mean, that was an odd thing to say, right? But I just nodded, figuring she was just being self-conscious or something. But then it started to get dark. She started telling me more about why her photos weren't real. She dropped the bombshell that she had spent years building a completely different persona for herself, on dating apps, in real life, everywhere. She admitted that she'd been lying about who she was for so long, not just with her photos, but with the entire version of herself she presented to the world. She said she built it all up so she could feel better about herself. I sat there, kind of frozen, trying to make sense of what she was saying. It was like everything I thought I knew about her was a lie. And the weirdest part, she wasn't even ashamed. She wasn't embarrassed or apologetic. She spoke about it so casually, like it was just a normal part of her life. The whole thing felt off. Like I wasn't talking to someone who was looking for a real connection, but rather someone who was completely obsessed with creating a fake version of themselves to get attention. The more she talked, the more disturbed I felt. She told me she wasn't just doing it with her photos, but with everything. She would create different identities on dating apps, changing her personality depending on who she was talking to. She even admitted that she was using the apps like therapy, trying to get validation from strangers. It wasn't about finding love. It was about feeling special, feeling wanted. The real her didn't exist, she said. She was just a series of personalities she could switch in and out of depending on who was looking. It was all so bizarre, and I wasn't sure what to do. I felt I was talking to someone who had completely lost touch with reality, someone who had built their entire self-worth on lies. But what disturbed me the most was how okay she seemed with it. She wasn't struggling with this at all. In fact, she almost seemed proud of it, like she was getting away with something clever. It was so unsettling, and I started to realize how deep this went. This wasn't just some superficial issue. This was something much darker. When I told her that what she was doing sounded unhealthy, that maybe she should consider trying to be more authentic, she didn't even flinch. She just shrugged it off like it was nothing. She casually said that people like me don't get real love, so I have to make it up. She was almost matter-of-fact about it, as if creating fake versions of herself was just part of the game. It was like she had convinced herself that this was the only way she could survive emotionally, and honestly, it freaked me out. It was like she was telling me that I was just another notch in her belt of validation-seeking behavior. Then came the worst part of the night. As we were getting ready to leave, she locked eyes with me in a way that made me feel trapped. It was like she was trying to pull me into her world of lies, trying to make me part of her game. She begged me to stay, to keep talking to her. Her eyes were so intense, like she was a predator looking for its prey. I could feel her desperation, and it made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't shake. I had to get out of there. I don't know what it was exactly, but the whole vibe felt suffocating. She was emotionally manipulating me without even realizing it. She had me feeling guilty for not accepting her fake self, for not embracing the lies she had spent years perfecting. It was like she was trying to make me feel responsible for her inability to connect with people in a real way, and it was exhausting, honestly. I couldn't stand it anymore. I got up to leave, trying to make an excuse about having to get home early, but I could feel her eyes on me as I walked out of the cafe. The whole time, it felt like she was trying to hold me in place, trying to make me stay in this emotionally draining situation. I walked out into the night feeling this weight on my chest, like I had just survived some kind of emotional ambush. It was so weird, so unsettling. I don't know if I'll ever understand what made her feel like she had to build that fake life, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't be a part of it. I don't know if I was the first person she tried to manipulate, but something told me I wouldn't be the last. That night, I went home feeling more suffocated than I ever had before, like I had just been played in a game I didn't even know the rules to. I've been talking to Harlan for weeks before we finally met. It was through a dating app, and I'll admit, his profile caught my attention. His photos were all polished and perfect. He was dressed in sharp suits, smiling next to private jets, traveling in places most people only dream about. He seemed to have it all, the kind of guy you'd expect to see in magazines, with a group of high-class friends and a life of luxury. Honestly, I was excited when he messaged me first. He seemed charming, the kind of guy who had his life together. I'd seen enough bad dates to last a lifetime, and Harlan seemed like the perfect change. When we decided to meet, I figured he'd be just as impressive in person. I imagined the same high-end vibe I saw in his photos, tailored suits, and a flash of an expensive watch. Maybe I was getting a little carried away, but I've been looking for someone like him. Someone with ambition, a bit of mystery, a dash of confidence. So when we agreed on a cafe for the first date, I was a bit nervous, but I was also kind of excited. I showed up early, dressed in my usual casual yet presentable style, and waited for him. I remember checking my phone every few minutes, convinced any second now the perfect, well-dressed guy would walk through the door. I kept picturing him, the kind of guy who had everything going for him. Then the door opened, and I froze. This wasn't the guy I was expecting. Instead of the sharp suit and confident stride, a guy in a hoodie and sweatpants shuffled in. He had a patchy beard, a noticeable gut hanging over his waistband, and the kind of slouch that made it look like he didn't care. He looked off. It took a second for him to notice me, and when he did, he smiled. But it wasn't the confident, polished smile I had imagined. It felt more like a nervous attempt to cover up something. He walked up to my table and sat down, glancing around like he wasn't sure if he made the right choice. We exchanged pleasantries, and I tried to mask the shock on my face. I tried to push the thought out of my head, but I couldn't ignore the gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. "You okay?" he asked, his voice unsure. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, trying to find something to say that wouldn't give away how confused I felt. After a few awkward moments, he finally spoke up, as though trying to explain himself. "I've put on some weight, but the photos are still me." I didn't know how to respond to that. Was he apologizing? Defending himself? I didn't expect him to look like a model, but the difference was so stark. The polished images he'd sent me painted a picture of someone else. Someone who didn't exist. As we started talking, I realized there was more to him than I had imagined. He wasn't just a guy who got dressed in a way that didn't match his photos. He was someone living a lie. Harlan wasn't just pretending to be someone else. He had been living as someone else for years. A rich, successful cousin who traveled the world, throwing around his wealth, buying expensive things, and gaining the attention of women who were attracted to the idea of a life like that. Harlan had stolen his cousin's identity online, using his photos, his stories, even his social circle. But the real Harlan was sitting right in front of me, someone who didn't seem to have much going for him at all. I was dumbfounded. How could anyone go this far to lie to people? I kept trying to wrap my head around it, but the more he talked, the stranger things became. He had been using his cousin's life as a mask, fooling everyone he met. The woman I was speaking to wasn't someone I could trust. When I tried to stand up and leave, that's when things started to get weird. Harlan's mood shifted, and the air between us grew heavy. He suddenly didn't seem as nervous as before. There was something almost desperate in his eyes. He grabbed my arm lightly but firmly enough that I couldn't just pull away. "You can't leave now," he said. The words felt cold, not at all the tone of a person who was joking or trying to make light of the situation. "I've invested too much time in you. I need to feel like I matter." The look in his eyes was unsettling. He didn't seem like the charming guy from the dating app anymore. He seemed like someone who was on the edge of losing control. I tried to ignore this sinking feeling in my stomach, but I couldn't. My thoughts raced, trying to figure out what was happening. "I'm sorry, I really have to go," I said, trying to pull my arm free. But Harlan didn't let go. His grip tightened slightly, and his eyes followed me as though he couldn't believe what I was saying. "You can't just walk away from this," he said, his voice now sounding more like a plea than anything else. "I can't just let you leave. Don't you understand? I need you to help me find myself." His words felt wrong. It didn't make sense. I didn't know what he wanted from me, but I could feel it in the air. This sense of urgency, of someone who was desperate for validation, someone who couldn't face the reality of what he had built. Harlan wasn't just playing a part anymore. He was unraveling. I managed to pull myself free and left the cafe in a rush, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked out the door, I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his stare following me all the way to the street. The panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. When I got home, I was bombarded by messages from him. Texts, DMs, even emails. He guilt-tripped me in every possible way, telling me that if I didn't stay and help him find himself, I would be just like everyone else who had abandoned him. I blocked him across every platform I could think of, but the messages kept coming. The worst part, he genuinely seemed to believe that I owed him something, that I was supposed to help him fix his life, like it was my job to patch up his broken sense of self. That night, I realized something. Harlan wasn't the person I thought he was. He wasn't charming. He wasn't the successful, well-dressed man in the photos. He was a desperate person clinging to someone else's life, unable to face the truth of his own, and I had been his latest target. I'd never thought a simple online date could lead me into something so messed up, but here we are. I matched with Evangeline one night when I was aimlessly scrolling through my dating app. Her profile immediately stood out. She looked like someone who had stepped out of a magazine. Elegant, sophisticated, the kind of woman you'd see at fancy events in those perfectly staged Instagram posts. Her photos were all professionally taken. A shot of her smiling on a yacht, another at a sleek rooftop bar in a suit that looked like it cost more than my rent, and a third one in a posh restaurant with her looking effortlessly chic. She seemed perfect, intelligent, confident, the kind of woman I thought I'd never even be able to talk to, let alone date. But there she was matching with me. We started chatting, and it was easy. She was sharp, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. We talked about everything from movies to travel to our favorite places in the city. It was one of those smooth conversations where everything just clicks. I was hooked. So we decided to meet up for coffee. I had this feeling like maybe this was going to be something special. After all, everything about her, at least online, screamed that she was way out of my league. But then the moment I saw her, I knew something was off. I was already sitting at the cafe when she walked in. I looked up from my phone, expecting the confident, polished woman I had seen in her photos. But instead, I saw someone who barely resembled the image I had built in my mind. She was shorter than I expected, wearing a baggy hoodie and sweatpants, with unkempt hair and minimal makeup. She had this tired, almost disinterested look on her face, as if the whole thing was a chore. My stomach did a quick flip, but I tried not to let it show. Maybe she was just having an off day, right? I mean, I'd seen enough online mismatches to know that not every profile is exactly what it seems. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just walked into something strange. She came over and we exchanged awkward pleasantries before she sat down across from me. I tried to keep the conversation going, but there was this cold distance in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. It was like she wasn't really seeing me, like she was looking through me, and that's when I decided to ask the obvious question. I couldn't help it. I had to say something about how different she looked from her photos. I wasn't trying to be rude, but I was just so thrown off by the complete contrast. I figured maybe she'd laugh it off or offer some sort of explanation. Instead, she casually shrugged like it was no big deal. That's when she said something that would stick with me long after I walked away from that date. I don't really care how I look in real life, she said, like it was the most casual thing in the world. Those photos are who I want to be. I didn't know how to respond to that. I mean, sure, we all want to look better online, don't we? But this was different. She wasn't just talking about using a filter or posting a slightly edited picture. She was talking about creating an entirely fake version of herself, one that she could hide behind. She explained that the woman in her photos wasn't real, that it was a carefully constructed image she'd created to feel better about herself. She used photos of models, celebrities, and even some of her friends, picking and choosing the best angles, clothes, and locations to make herself seem like someone she wasn't. The woman I was sitting across from had built a lie so elaborate that I wasn't sure if she even remembered who the real Evangeline was anymore. But it didn't stop there. As she kept talking, they got worse. She told me that this wasn't just something she did for dating apps. No, she'd been lying to everyone in her life. Her friends, her family, even her coworkers. She created this persona of someone wealthy, successful, and polished. She'd even gone as far as telling people she worked in high-end marketing and was constantly traveling for her job. The truth, though, was that she was barely scraping by, living in a tiny apartment and working a dead-end office job that she hated. She kept up this facade for so long that she was starting to believe it herself. I sat there, stunned, trying to process the craziness of it all. It was like I was listening to someone confess to a crime, except this wasn't just a one-time thing. She had been living a lie for years. As she spoke, it felt like the world around me was fading. I could barely focus on her words anymore. I was just staring at her, trying to understand how someone could do something like this. It was all so unreal. How could someone lie like this for so long? And why? Was she trying to prove something to herself? To the world? To me? I couldn't wrap my head around it, but what struck me the most was how completely detached she seemed from it all. It was as if the truth didn't matter anymore, like she had become so wrapped up in the lie that it had become her reality. The worst part, though, was when she admitted that she felt like she couldn't stop. She couldn't face the real world anymore because it wasn't good enough for her. The woman in those photos, perfect, confident, successful, was who she wanted to be, and she had no idea how to make that happen in real life. But here's the thing, as she told me all of this, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Evangeline didn't just want to be that perfect version of herself. She wanted other people to see it too. She needed it. It wasn't enough for her to live in the fantasy world she created. She needed everyone else to buy into it. And I was just the latest person she tried to pull into her web of lies. I had this overwhelming urge to get up and leave, but I couldn't. I felt like I was frozen in place, caught in this weird conversation that felt more like a confession than a date. I tried to make some excuse to leave, but every time I moved toward the door, I felt like I was betraying her somehow, like leaving would make the whole thing worse. But I had to get out of there. I had to. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made my escape. I didn't even look back as I walked out of that cafe. My heart was racing and my mind was spinning. The whole thing felt surreal. I had just spent an hour talking to a woman who had been lying to everyone around her for years, and all I could think about was how terrifying it was to realize that some people were so lost in their own illusions that they didn't know how to get out. As I got home, I sat on my couch and tried to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't. The whole date felt like a train wreck I couldn't stop watching. The worst part was, I wasn't even sure if I felt bad for her or if I was just scared. Either way, I knew I'd never forget that first date. Not because it was romantic or because it went well, but because it was one of the most disturbing things I'd ever experienced. And that was the last time I ever heard from Evangeline. Looking back, I still don't know what to think. Maybe she was just an incredibly insecure person who had created this alternate version of herself as a coping mechanism. Or maybe she was just someone who was too far gone, too deep into her lies to ever see the truth again. All I know is that for me, that date was a wake-up call, one I'll never forget. I never thought I'd get tricked so badly on a dating app, but Roy really took the cake. His profile was the kind of thing that made me want to drop everything and go on a date right then and there. Pictures of him flying through the air on a dirt bike, looking like some kind of extreme sports pro, and another of him scaling a cliff with the sunset in the background. The guy looked like a total badass, like he belonged in a movie or an action sports ad. I didn't even hesitate to swipe right. It wasn't just the photos either. His bio mentioned he was into everything from skydiving to rock climbing, and he talked about how much he loved the adrenaline rush of trying new sports. Basically, he seemed like the type of guy who lived life to the fullest. What could go wrong? When we agreed to meet up, I was excited, but honestly, I had those little butterflies in my stomach, wondering if he was really as cool as his profile made him out to be. It was a Saturday, and we decided to meet at this cozy cafe near the park. I showed up a little early, trying to calm my nerves and pretend like I wasn't secretly hoping he'd look like the guy in his pictures. I waited, watching everyone who walked by, trying to guess who might be him. After about 15 minutes, a guy walked in who looked nothing like the photos. I stared in for a second, trying to figure it out. Was this the same person I had been chatting with online? He was shorter than I expected, had thin hair, and his body wasn't the muscular, fit figure I had imagined. He wasn't fat, but he definitely wasn't the athletic, toned guy from his pictures. He looked, well, kind of soft, with a slight slouch to his posture. He didn't have that confident air I expected either. Instead, he looked shy, like he wasn't sure he was in the right place. He spotted me across the room and waved awkwardly, which didn't exactly scream action sports enthusiast. I waved back and forced a smile, trying to keep my disappointment from showing. As he walked over to the table, I tried to put the strange feeling I had aside and remind myself that maybe the photos weren't everything. Maybe he was just having an off day. But as he sat down and we started talking, it became pretty clear that something was off. I tried to make small talk about the place we were at, but he just seemed nervous, fumbling over his words and glancing around the cafe like he was unsure of what to do next. It didn't make sense. This was the guy who claimed to live on the edge, always doing crazy stunts and pushing his limits. But the guy in front of me couldn't even seem to make eye contact for more than a second. I couldn't help it. I had to ask, "Hey, I noticed that you look a little different than the guy in the pictures. What's up with that?" I tried to sound casual, not wanting to come off too harsh, but my curiosity was eating away at me. That's when things got even weirder. He gave me this nervous little chuckle and shrugged, then confessed that the photos weren't even his. They were of his ex-colleague, someone who was a professional athlete. He had been using those photos to make himself seem like someone he wasn't. At first, I thought he was joking. I mean, no one does that, right? But as the words sank in, I realized he was being serious. He wasn't just using a few edited shots or some stock photos like most people do. He had completely lifted the life of someone else to impress women like me. I sat there, not sure what to say. How was this even real? Here I was sitting across from a guy who wasn't just lying about his hobbies or interests, but about his entire identity. But it didn't stop there. The whole baddest extreme sports guy was a total fabrication. He didn't do any of the things he claimed to do. In fact, he told me that he barely even liked sports. Most of the things he had said about his lifestyle were just stories he had pieced together from watching others. He didn't even enjoy adrenaline-filled activities. It was all for show, all to get attention, to be seen as someone worthy of admiration. I kept listening, trying to process everything. It wasn't just his photos that were lies. It was his whole personality. He'd been pretending to be someone who had it all together, someone fearless and full of adventure, when in reality he was just not. The more he talked, the more I realized that Roy had built this completely fake world for himself. He had created a persona he couldn't live up to, and now he was stuck. He had no idea how to be real anymore, so he just kept feeding the lie. The worst part, it wasn't like he was apologetic about it. He didn't seem ashamed or embarrassed. If anything, he looked kind of proud of himself. Like this was a strategy he had perfected. He said that he knew people like the version of him he had built, and that was enough for him. He told me he didn't feel bad about it because, in his mind, it was easier to be someone else than to face the reality of his own life. That's when I realized this wasn't just a harmless dating profile mistake. This was a guy who had been lying for so long, he didn't even know how to be real anymore. I sat there, stunned, trying to make sense of it all. The more he talked, the more I realized that I wasn't just sitting across from a guy who had used some misleading photos. I was sitting across from someone who had created an entirely different life for himself, and he didn't seem interested in changing it. He wasn't looking for someone who could love the real him. He just wanted someone to buy into the version of him that he had spent years perfecting. I honestly didn't know what to do. I felt trapped in this weird conversation with a guy who wasn't even who he said he was. I couldn't stay there anymore, so I made some excuse about having to leave. He seemed disappointed, but I could tell it wasn't about me. He was more upset that his version of himself hadn't been enough to keep me interested. I gave him a half-hearted smile and quickly left, my head spinning. I walked down the street, trying to process everything that had just happened. I had met guys with inflated egos before, but this was something else. It wasn't just a little white lie. Roy had built an entire life that wasn't his. He was so deep into this fantasy of who he thought he should be that he couldn't even see who he really was anymore. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the whole date. It felt like I'd been in a strange dream where nothing was what it seemed, and I had been left in the wake of someone else's delusion. What scared me wasn't just that he had lied. What scared me was how deeply he had lost touch with himself. It made me wonder how many people were out there living like him, pretending to be someone else to escape the truth. I never heard from Roy again, and to be honest, I was relieved. The whole thing was so disturbing that I wasn't sure I wanted to hear from him ever again. I'd never thought a first date could throw me into a complete existential spiral, but meeting Indigo was nothing like I imagined. Her profile on the dating app immediately caught my attention. It wasn't the usual "I love to travel and drink coffee" kind of bio. No, Indigo's profile was a masterpiece in itself, artsy, mysterious, and enigmatic. Her photos were dark and brooding like something out of a film noir. She wore vintage clothing that looked like it came straight from a different era, and her makeup was always flawless, accentuating her deep-set eyes and pale skin. She had that vibe, the kind of woman who could be a lead in an indie film or the muse of a photographer obsessed with capturing shadows. I'd swiped right immediately. Something about her seemed magnetic. She gave off this aura of someone who didn't need to fit in, who thrived in their own world of artistry and introspection. It seemed like she was so in touch with her emotions, her spirit, that I could get lost in the deep, intimate conversations we have. I had no idea if it would be a disaster or a dream come true, but I was intrigued. When we finally decided to meet up, I suggested a small art gallery that specialized in abstract contemporary pieces. It felt fitting for someone like her. She agreed, and we settled on a time. I remember checking my watch the night before, eager and nervous, because I couldn't stop thinking about what she might be like in person. When I first laid eyes on her at the gallery, I froze. It wasn't the indigo I'd seen in her photos. The first thing I noticed was her height. She was much smaller than I expected. The woman in her photos had an almost ethereal, towering presence, but in front of me was someone who seemed different. She wasn't unappealing, but the real-life version of her was a far cry from the polished persona she had crafted online. Her vintage look was still there, but it felt off. The clothes were frumpy, and the makeup was poorly applied, not even close to the flawless face in her photos. She looked tired. Her eyes, which were once mesmerizing in her pictures, looked hollow, and the energy I'd expected from someone whose creativity felt like it had been sucked out of her. I tried not to let it show. Maybe she was having a bad day, right? But I couldn't shake the jarring difference between the online version of Indigo and the one sitting in front of me. As we walked through the gallery, I could feel the tension between us. I asked about her work, her thoughts on the pieces around us, but her responses were flat, disinterested, almost as if she was no longer invested in the lifestyle she had portrayed online. It was hard to focus on the art when I couldn't stop thinking about the disconnect between the person I had been speaking to for weeks and the woman in front of me. Eventually, I gathered the courage to address the elephant in the room. I wasn't sure how to phrase it without sounding rude, but I couldn't help it. The contrast was too stark. So I brought it up. I asked why she looked so different. I wasn't trying to call her out, but it just slipped out. To my surprise, she didn't get defensive or offended. Instead, she let out a sigh, almost as if she'd been waiting for someone to ask. She explained that she didn't look like the person in her photos anymore. The girl in those pictures was the perfect version of herself, the version that she had carefully curated for others to see. She had used those images to create this mystique around her life, to get attention, to be admired. She confessed that the woman she had portrayed online wasn't real. She was an exaggerated version of who she wanted to be, not who she actually was. At first, I didn't know what to say. I was in shock. All those photos, those captivating, dark, artistic photos, weren't just carefully edited or taken in the right lighting. They weren't even of her. She had been using those photos to create a persona, a false identity, to pull people into her world, a world that seemed so unreachable and fascinating. But as she continued, the truth sank in even deeper. She didn't just lie about the photos. She had been lying about her entire lifestyle, about the artsy, mysterious, deeply introspective woman that she had built online. That woman didn't exist. It was a fantasy that she had constructed, piece by piece, to gain attention and admiration. She used this idealized version of herself to attract people who would admire the artistic, enigmatic life she pretended to lead. But in reality, Indigo was nothing like that. She didn't live a creative, artistic lifestyle. She was just another person with a regular job, struggling with the same mundane stuff as anyone else. And it wasn't just a dating app game for her. This was something much bigger. She had created a false narrative that she used with everyone in her life, friends, family, even coworkers. They all thought she was this deep artistic soul, someone who lived for the arts and was always lost in thought, with a wardrobe full of vintage clothing and an eye for beauty. But in truth, she was just playing a role. She was using this online self to hide behind, to get attention and validation from the people around her. I sat there completely dumbfounded. It wasn't just that she had built a fake profile or used photos that weren't hers. It was the fact that she had created a whole persona, a whole life, that wasn't real. And she was okay with it. She didn't seem upset or remorseful, just resigned to the fact that this was who she had become. She couldn't seem to find a way out of it. She couldn't stop playing this part because it had become so ingrained in who she thought she was. It was like she had completely detached from her real self. The whole date turned into a strange, uncomfortable experience. I tried to continue talking, but the words felt empty. I didn't know who I was talking to anymore. Was this the real Indigo, or was this just another performance? I kept trying to make sense of everything she had said, but it felt like I was trapped in some kind of twisted mind game. Eventually, I made an excuse to leave. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to be rude, but the more she talked, the more I felt like I was being sucked into something I didn't understand. I left the gallery with my head spinning, unsure of what had just happened. I'd gone there to meet someone I thought was interesting, someone who could maybe be a part of my life. Instead, I'd met a woman who had no idea who she actually was, a woman who had built an entire fake world for herself and was now stuck living in it. I never saw her again. We texted a couple of times after the date, but it quickly faded. I couldn't keep up with someone who was so lost in their own lie. The whole thing still messes with me. I don't even know what the lesson is here. Maybe it's that people will go to great lengths to escape from who they really are, or maybe it's just that first impressions don't mean a thing in the world of online dating. Either way, Indigo wasn't the person I thought she was, and I'm still not sure who she really is. I've moved on, but I'll always remember that day, meeting someone who, in some ways, didn't even exist. I matched with Jet on a dating app late one night when I was bored, scrolling aimlessly through profiles. His photos grabbed my attention right away. He was handsome, fit, and always in designer clothes. The kind of guy who looked like he belonged on magazine covers or at a VIP table in some exclusive club. In every picture, he was either speeding across the water on a jet ski or lounging on a beach somewhere tropical with a perfect sunset behind him. It seemed too good to be true, but in that moment, I didn't care. I swiped right without thinking twice, half expecting him to never respond. But he did. Our conversations were easy, lighthearted at first, and I couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to meet him in person. He seemed like the kind of guy who lived life to the fullest, confident, successful, the kind of person you'd want to be around. The more we talked, the more intrigued I became. I wasn't looking for anything too serious, but I was definitely curious about the kind of life someone like him led. So we decided to meet at a casual cafe near the water. I got there early, a little anxious but mostly excited. I figured I'd get there first and let him make the entrance. I had already built up this image of him in my head. Tall, charming, dressed in some sleek, expensive clothes. I could already see him walking in, turning heads like a scene out of a movie. But when he walked in, everything I had imagined shattered in an instant. There was no jet ski, no designer clothes, no perfect smile. Instead, Jet was wearing a cheap, wrinkled t-shirt, and his jeans looked like they'd seen better days. His hair was messy, and his face wasn't the fresh, glowing one from his photos. His smile seemed forced, like he was trying too hard to appear confident. There was a nervous energy about him that I hadn't expected. I almost didn't recognize him at first. It was like meeting a completely different person. He sat down across from me and started with the usual small talk, but I could tell right away that something was off. I wasn't sure if it was just a case of nerves or if it was something deeper, but I couldn't ignore the gap between who I thought he was and who he actually was. I didn't say anything at first, trying to figure out how to approach it, but after a few minutes, I couldn't hold back anymore. I asked him about the photos. I wasn't trying to be rude, just curious. He laughed nervously, like he knew the question was coming. His answer caught me completely off guard. He said he used to look like that, but things had changed. Life had changed. He went on to explain that the guy in those photos wasn't who he was anymore. The jet skis, the tropical getaways, the designer clothes, they were all part of a life he'd been pretending to have. He admitted that he had spent years building a persona around a fake life, one that he thought would get him attention from women. And it worked at least for a while. As he kept talking, I realized it wasn't just the photos that were fake. He had built his entire life around this lie. The jet ski, the beach vacations, the sleep parties, it was all a fantasy. The truth was he was just a regular guy working a regular job, living a life that didn't match the image he created online. He wasn't living the high-end life he portrayed. He was just another guy pretending to be something he wasn't, hoping someone would notice him. The more Jet opened up, the more disturbing it became. He wasn't just lying about the details of his life. He had convinced himself that this fake persona was who he was. He said he'd been pretending for so long that he didn't know who he was without it. It was like he had completely lost himself in this illusion of success, this world he had built to feel important. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to understand, but at the same time, I couldn't help feeling a little repulsed by how deep the lie ran. He wasn't just hiding behind photos, he was hiding behind an entire version of himself that didn't even exist. I sat there trying to process it all, but it was like trying to talk to a ghost. He didn't seem to be the person in front of me. He was still a guy from those photos, the one he thought everyone would like, the one he had built so many years ago. As the conversation went on, I started to feel trapped. I didn't know what to do or how to react. I wanted to leave, but at the same time, I felt bad for him. It was clear that he wasn't just ashamed of his fake life. He was scared. He didn't know who he was without it. The lie had become so ingrained in him that it was hard to tell where the fake Jet ended and the real Jet began. He told me that if he couldn't be the person he had been pretending to be, that he didn't know who he was at all. And in that moment, it hit me. He wasn't just lost in the lie. He had become the lie. I told him I needed to go. I wasn't sure what else to say or how to handle the situation. I tried to stand up, but as soon as I did, I felt his hand on my arm. I turned to face him, and that's when he followed me outside, pleading for me not to judge him for who he really was. He told me that I was the first person who ever made him feel like he was worth something, and now I was walking away. He said that if no one cared about the real him, then what was the point of being real? What was the point of being himself if no one would ever appreciate it? At that moment, I realized how deep his insecurities ran. It wasn't just about the lie he created. It was about the fact that he had built his entire self-worth around something that wasn't even real. He didn't know how to be genuine anymore. He had spent so much time pretending to be someone else that he couldn't figure out who he was without the fake life he had constructed. I stood there, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to make him understand that I wasn't walking away because I thought he was worthless. I just couldn't deal with the fact that he didn't know how to be himself. I left and I haven't heard from him since. I couldn't handle it, the weight of his desperation hanging over me. The whole thing was too much, too deep, and too complicated. I walked away not knowing what had happened to the real Jet, or if he would ever find his way back to himself. I think about that night a lot, though. The way someone can get so lost in their own lives that they don't even know who they are anymore, and how sometimes the hardest thing in the world is to be real, even if no one's watching. Her profile is full of photos from dreamy locations, exotic beaches, sunset views from luxury hotels, and her posing on mountaintops with this carefree, adventurous vibe. She looked like someone who had their life together in the best possible way. She was a travel blogger, or at least that's what she said. She seemed to be living the life I only dreamed about, constantly traveling, exploring new places, meeting interesting people. I had to admit, I was a little jealous of the way her life appeared so effortlessly perfect. We hit it off immediately in our conversations. She was funny, easy to talk to, and seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. She'd send me pictures from her travels, and we'd chat about places we'd both want to visit. I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, I had met someone special. It felt like everything was falling into place. When we decided to meet up, I couldn't contain my excitement. We agreed on a cafe in the city, a cozy spot with a good view. I imagined her walking in, effortlessly stemming in a flowy dress, like she had just stepped out of one of her photos. I spent the whole morning getting ready, trying to look as presentable as I could. I kept thinking about how amazing it would be to meet this person who seemed to have it all together. But when she arrived, everything I had imagined fell apart in an instant. Eliza walked in wearing jeans, a plain t-shirt, and sneakers. She didn't look anything like the polished, glamorous woman in the photos. Her hair was messy, like she had just rolled out of bed, and she was fidgeting with her hands, looking a little nervous. Her posture was off too, slouch, like she was trying to hide behind herself. It felt like a complete contrast to the confident, carefree person I had built up in my head. I didn't want to jump to conclusions right away. Maybe she was having a bad day or wasn't in the mood to dress up, I told myself. But the longer we sat and talked, the more I realized something was off. She wasn't relaxed like I expected her to be. She was clearly uncomfortable, shifting in her seat and avoiding eye contact. It was strange because in our messages, she was nothing like this. She seemed so confident online. So why was she acting like this in person? I could feel my stomach tightening as I started to pick up on the underlying tension. Something was wrong. I didn't want to press her, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of confusion. After a few more awkward silences, she finally blurted it out, and my world shifted. She admitted that none of the photos in her profile were actually hers. The beautiful pictures of her in front of stunning beaches, climbing mountains, and sipping cocktails at fancy resorts, they weren't hers at all. They were pictures of a popular influencer she followed and admired. She had been using these photos for years to create an illusion of a life she didn't actually live. Her voice cracked when she said it, and I could see how ashamed she felt. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. How could this be happening? How could someone go so far to build a life that wasn't theirs? As Eliza spoke, everything started to make sense. At the same time, it became more disturbing. She explained that she had been pretending to live this amazing, adventurous life because in reality, she felt like a nobody. She wasn't traveling the world, staying in luxury hotels, or living the life she portrayed. She was just an ordinary woman, working a 9-to-5 job, stuck in a routine she hated. She said she felt like a failure when she compared herself to the person she had created online. The more she talked, the more I understood how deeply she had fallen into this lie. She wasn't just using these photos to impress people. She had convinced herself that this fake life was who she really was. She had built an entire identity around it, one that she couldn't let go of because she didn't know who she was without it. I could see the pain in her eyes as she admitted how long she had been living this double life, how lost she felt every time she looked at the version of herself online. But it wasn't just the photos or the lies about her lifestyle. It was deeper than that. She told me that she felt like if she couldn't keep up with this version of herself, she'd have nothing left. No one would care about the real Eliza, the one who was just living a regular life. It was like she had built this mask that everyone loved, and now she didn't know how to take it off. I could feel the weight of her words pressing on me. It was like she was trapped in a web of her own making, unable to escape from the persona she had created. Then came the part that really sent a chill down my spine. After a long pause, she looked at me with these wide, desperate eyes and asked me, "What if I couldn't be this person anymore? What would you do?" I froze. I didn't know how to answer her. She wasn't asking me if I liked her. She wasn't asking me to forgive her for the lies. She was asking me what would happen if she couldn't pretend to be someone else anymore. What would I do if she was just herself? The real Eliza, the one behind the photos, the one who didn't have her life figured out and wasn't traveling the world in designer clothes. I didn't know how to respond. The question hung in the air, thick and heavy, and I realized in that moment how deeply she feared being rejected for who she really was. It was a fear so intense that she had completely lost herself in the persona she had built. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something dark, something real and raw, and I didn't know if I could handle it. I tried to say something reassuring, but the truth was I wasn't sure what to say. I felt a mix of sympathy and unease. I had spent the past few weeks thinking I was talking to someone who had it all together, someone whose life was exciting and full of promise. But now I was face to face with someone who was lost, hiding behind an illusion they couldn't maintain. I made some excuse about needing to leave. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with that question hanging in the air. I didn't want to judge her, but I also couldn't ignore the uncomfortable reality of the situation. I couldn't pretend like everything was fine. As I walked away, I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. What if I couldn't be this person anymore? What would I do? The question echoed in my mind long after I left. I knew Eliza needed help, but I wasn't sure I was the right person to give it to her. All I knew was that I had just witnessed someone unraveling, and it was something I wasn't prepared for. I never heard from her again, and part of me is relieved, but another part of me can't forget that question. What if she couldn't be that person anymore? Would I have stuck around to help her find out who she really was? Or would I have walked away like I did, unsure of how to deal with the truth? I matched with Flora one late night while mindlessly scrolling through my dating app, something I rarely do anymore. Her profile photos were stunning. Gorgeous, vibrant, and full of life. She was standing on beaches at sunset, dining in fancy restaurants, posing in outfits that screamed high fashion and luxury. Her eyes had this spark of confidence, and her whole vibe was effortlessly glamorous. Everything about her was perfect. I wasn't even thinking twice about swiping right. This was the kind of person I thought only existed in magazines or on Instagram influencer pages. Our conversations were easy, almost too good to be true. She was witty, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. It didn't take long before we decided to meet in person. I'll admit I was nervous but also excited. I had built up this image of her in my mind, expecting someone who fit that glamorous persona, someone whose life was filled with exciting, luxurious adventures. We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown, nothing too fancy, but still a comfortable, chill spot where we could talk. I got there early, tried to calm my nerves, and kept checking my phone, half expecting her to show up looking just as perfect as her pictures. I had it all planned out in my head. She'd walk in, look stunning, and everything would just fall into place. But when Flora arrived, my heart sank. The woman who walked through that door was not the woman I had been talking to online. She was wearing old, faded clothes, nothing like the fashionable outfits in her photos. She didn't have that polished, glowing appearance I had imagined. Her hair was flat, and there was an awkwardness about her, like she wasn't fully comfortable in her own skin. She was shorter than I expected, and her makeup was completely different from the perfectly done-up version in her pictures. The person in front of me didn't match the version I had created in my mind at all. I tried to ignore the discomfort bubbling up inside me and smiled, standing up to greet her. Flora did the same, but there was a clear tension in the air. She seemed nervous, a little on edge, and didn't make eye contact for too long. It felt like something was off, and as she sat down, she gave me this weak, almost apologetic smile. I was just staring at her, trying to wrap my mind around what was happening. She didn't waste any time before saying it, the bombshell that completely rocked my world. She admitted that the photos I'd seen in her profile weren't even her. They were all taken from a past life she had created, a fake version of herself. Those glamorous pictures of her on exotic beaches, those weren't from her. She had taken someone else's persona, someone she admired, and used those photos to craft a life for herself that didn't exist. As I sat there trying to process what she was saying, she told me that she had used a different name too. Not Flora. It wasn't even close. She'd been pretending to be someone she wasn't for so long that it felt like a second identity to her. Her whole online life had been fabricated to make her appear successful, attractive, and desirable, because in reality, she felt like a nobody. She confessed that she was ashamed of her real self and had built this fantasy persona to get attention and validation from others. She said it made her feel better, like she mattered, even if it wasn't real. I felt like I was suffocating in the moment, like the ground was slipping from under me. It wasn't just that she had lied. It was how deeply she had buried herself in this lie. She had been living in a world of pretend for so long that she didn't know how to break free. She was so caught up in this fabricated version of herself that she felt like it was the only thing anyone could ever love or appreciate. I sat there, staring at her, my mind racing. She wasn't just talking about a few minor fabrications. This was a complete life built on deception. She wasn't the woman I thought she was. She wasn't the glamorous, confident, adventurous person I had imagined. She was just someone trying to escape her own reality by creating a new one that she could control. It was as if she had built this perfect world around herself, but when I saw her in person, the illusion shattered and I realized that none of it was real. It wasn't just the photos or the fake name, it was everything. She had convinced herself that this online persona was who she really was. She had spent so much time pretending that it felt like the truth, even though deep down, she knew it was all a lie. She had become so trapped in this version of herself that the idea of being authentic, of showing her true self, seemed impossible. She had created this glamorous, perfect life because she thought no one would care about her real life. The worst part, the thing that haunted me, was when she looked at me with wide, almost desperate eyes and asked, "What if I couldn't be this person anymore? What would you do?" It wasn't just a question. It was a plea for validation. She was asking me what would happen if she had to stop pretending, if she had to let go of the fake life she had built. She didn't know who she was anymore, and she was asking me what my reaction would be if I saw the real her. The person underneath the layers of makeup, the fancy clothes, the photos from another life. What would I do if she couldn't be the person I thought she was? I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know what to say. There was this heavy, suffocating silence hanging between us, and I felt like I was drowning in it. The question echoed in my mind, and I didn't know how to respond. How could I respond? She was asking me to choose between the illusion she had built and the person who was sitting in front of me. I think at that moment I realized something, that the real Flora was someone who wasn't sure of who she was anymore. She had built this perfect persona, this life of luxury and adventure, but it was all just a performance. She didn't know how to stop pretending, and I wasn't sure I could stay and watch her continue to live this lie. I made an excuse to leave, something about having an early meeting the next day. I didn't want to make her feel worse, but I couldn't stay. The whole thing felt wrong. I wasn't mad at her. I wasn't even upset. I just didn't know how to deal with what I had just learned. I didn't know how to process the fact that everything I thought I knew about this person was a complete fabrication. I stood up, said goodbye, and left. feeling like I had just walked out of a dream into something far darker than I ever expected. I never saw Flora again after that. I still think about her sometimes, about the person she pretended to be and the person she was underneath it all. She wasn't a bad person. She was just lost. And for a long time, I didn't know if I could ever understand what drove her to build such a complex lie. But I know this much: the truth was scarier than anything I had ever imagined. I've been on my fair share of online dates, but nothing could have prepared me for the one I had with Harper. Her profile on the dating app looked like something out of a magazine. Beautiful, confident, with an aura of mystery that made her seem like the type of person who had everything figured out. Her pictures were perfect: beach sunsets, hiking trails with scenic mountain backdrops, fancy dinners in high-end restaurants, and photos of her dressed in stylish outfits that made her look effortlessly chic. She had that Instagram model vibe, the kind of person you look at and think, they must be living their best life. We had chatted for a few weeks before we decided to meet in person. The conversations were easy, funny, and flirty. She seemed down to earth, despite the glamorous images she put out there. When we agreed on a spot for our date, a small cafe by the lake, I was excited. I pictured her walking in, radiating charm, maybe wearing one of those outfits from her photos. I thought it would be perfect. But when I saw her in person, I almost didn't recognize her. She walked in and immediately I was taken aback. Harper looked different, a lot different. Her hair, which in the photos looked shiny and full of life, was limp, almost greasy. Her skin, which appeared so flawless in her pictures, was blotchy and uneven. She looked tired, no, exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes had this drained, hollow look in them. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off and told myself that maybe she was just having a rough day. We all have them, right? But something about the whole situation was unsettling. I stood up to greet her, trying to push the confusion aside. She gave me a tired smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. We sat down and started talking, and for the first few minutes, it wasn't terrible. She was polite, but there was this strange distance in her tone. It was like she wasn't really there. She'd look at me every once in a while, but her gaze would wander off to something else, like she wasn't fully engaged. I tried to ignore it. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she had a lot on her mind. But then it started to get worse. As we talked, Harper seemed to zone out more and more. She'd be in the middle of a sentence, and suddenly her eyes would drift, and it was like she wasn't even aware of what she was saying anymore. She'd stop talking mid-sentence and just stare into space. It was getting harder to hold a conversation with her, and the longer we sat there, the more awkward it felt. I wasn't sure if I should say something, but the curiosity was killing me. I had asked. I asked her why she looked so different from her photos, and as soon as I said it, I knew I had crossed some kind of line. She visibly flinched, almost like I hit a nerve. Her body language shifted, and for a second, she seemed genuinely scared. Her smile faded, and she became incredibly uncomfortable, shifting in her seat, eyes darting around. She didn't answer right away, and I could tell she was wrestling with something. It was the first time during the entire date that I saw her look fully awake, and the expression on her face wasn't what I expected. She seemed torn, like she was afraid of something. I could feel this tension hanging between us, thick and heavy, and I suddenly wished I hadn't said anything at all. But then she took a deep breath and told me everything. And when she spoke, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. She admitted that the photos on her profile weren't even hers. They were all taken from a completely different life, a life she created for herself. The photos of her in exotic locations, the ones of her laughing with friends over a glass of wine, the fancy dinner shots, all of that was a lie. She had been using someone else's pictures, images from a woman she'd followed online, to build a persona that wasn't real. Harper didn't look like the woman in those pictures. She didn't even live the life she portrayed. She wasn't the confident, beautiful woman I'd imagined. She was just herself, someone completely different, someone who didn't seem to know who they were. I was floored. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to leave right then and there, but I also felt for her. She looked so vulnerable, so small, sitting across from me like a shell of the person I had imagined. But the weirdest part wasn't just the fake photos. It was the way she said it. It wasn't the "hey, I messed up" confession. It was like she was confessing to something much darker, something she couldn't take back. She said she felt like she couldn't live up to the life she had built. She couldn't face the real world, so she hid behind the image of someone else. She went on to tell me that she had been doing this for years, pretending to be someone she wasn't, not just online, but in her real life as well. She had become so wrapped up in this fake identity that she couldn't tell where it ended and where she began. She'd been using these photos and this fake lifestyle to get attention, to feel validated, because in her real life, she felt invisible, like no one cared about the person she actually was. She wasn't the glamorous woman in the photos, she was someone completely different. And she didn't know how to be that person. And that's when it hit me, the real horror. She looked at me, and with a strange kind of intensity in her eyes, she said something that made my blood run cold. She asked me, "Would you still marry me?" Her words hung in the air between us, and I couldn't move. She wasn't asking me to forgive her. She wasn't even asking for my understanding. She was asking me if I could accept her, the real her, the woman sitting in front of me, not the one I had seen online. The one who was tired, who didn't have the perfect life, who felt like she didn't measure up. I didn't know how to answer her. How could I? Could I accept this person who had been lying for so long? Could I accept someone who had spent their life hiding behind a facade? I wanted to say something comforting, but all I could do was stare at her, trying to process everything she had just confessed. I didn't know if I was angry, sad, or just confused. But I knew one thing: this wasn't the date I had signed up for. The rest of the time we spent together was a blur. I tried to keep the conversation going, but it was strained, awkward. I could feel the weight of her confession pressing down on me, and it was too much to take in all at once. I didn't know what to do, so I just said I had to leave. I didn't look back as I walked out of that cafe, my mind spinning. I felt like I had just learned something deeply unsettling about the person sitting across from me. I didn't know if I would ever hear from Harper again. Part of me wanted to give her a chance, but another part of me knew that the truth she had just shared was something I couldn't easily forget. The illusion was gone, and what remained was a person I wasn't sure how to look at. I didn't have any grand revelations or answers. I just walked away, shaken and unsure of what I had just experienced. I matched with Grace on a dating app, and from the start, she seemed like the kind of person who had it all together. Her profile was filled with happy pictures of her out with friends at clubs, hiking in the mountains, or enjoying weekends at the beach. Every photo screamed adventure, confidence, and social success. She looked like someone who was always having fun, living the kind of life that you'd expect from someone featured in a travel magazine or an influencer's blog. I couldn't help but feel drawn to her, even though deep down, something about it felt a little too perfect, like she was living a life I could never keep up with. We chatted for a few days before we decided to meet up in person. I was excited, maybe even a little too excited. I imagined the two of us having a great time, just like the carefree adventures I'd seen in her pictures. I kept thinking about how we would click, how it would be so easy and effortless. But when I actually saw her in person, it didn't take long to realize that the Grace from the photos was nowhere to be found. When she walked into the coffee shop, I was immediately taken aback. She didn't look anything like the vibrant, confident woman in her photos. Instead, she was standing there, hesitant, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Her clothes were plain and messy, nothing like the trendy outfits she wore in her photos. Her skin looked dull and tired, her hair unkempt, and there was this strange, almost defeated vibe about her. She barely made eye contact, and when she did, it was as if she was avoiding something. I tried to smile, but my stomach dropped. This wasn't the person I'd been talking to. We sat down, and things only got more awkward from there. She didn't seem to know what to say. The conversation was stiff, and there was this heavy silence hanging between us. I tried to ask her about her day, about what she'd been up to, but it felt like I was pulling teeth just to get a simple response. She kept fidgeting with her hands, her eyes wandering to the window like she wanted to be anywhere but here. It was nothing like the confident, outgoing Grace I had been chatting with online. This person seemed so small, so quiet. For the next hour or so, we sat in silence. I could tell she was uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to fix it. I kept telling myself that maybe she was just having a bad day or that she needed time to warm up. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like something wasn't right. The Grace I had imagined was nowhere to be found. Instead, I was sitting across from someone who was almost unrecognizable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of awkward silence, she looked up at me, almost like she was finally ready to say something. That's when the truth came out, and everything about the date turned upside down. Grace wasn't even her real name. The photos on her profile, The ones where she was smiling with her friends, hiking in picturesque locations, and dining in beautiful restaurants. Those weren't hers either. She told me that she had been using the name of a popular influencer she admired, along with her photos, to create this perfect image of herself. She wasn't the person I thought she was. The confident, adventurous woman I had been chatting with for weeks didn't exist. She had been pretending to be someone else entirely. At that moment, I didn't know what to say. I was in shock. I had been talking to someone who wasn't real. It was like the whole persona she had created was just a mask she wore to get attention. And the worst part was that it wasn't just about the photos. Grace had been doing this for years, assuming different identities, pretending to live lives that weren't hers. She admitted to me that she had convinced herself that if she lived this way, if she pretended to be someone else, people would finally love her. The more she spoke, the more I realized how deep this went. She wasn't just pretending to be a few people online. She had been living these fake lives in real life too. She had been lying to everyone, to herself, to her friends, and even to her family. Each version of her was more glamorous than the last. It wasn't about the photos anymore. It was about an entire life built on lies. She had created these versions of herself because she couldn't stand the idea of being seen for who she really was. I felt a weird mix of empathy and disgust. I didn't know if I should feel sorry for her or if I should walk out the door and never look back. But just when I was starting to wrap my head around what she was saying, the real horror started to unfold. She told me that she hadn't just been pretending to be someone else online. She had been stalking me. She had been following my social media, studying my interests, and creating a fake persona just to connect with me. Everything we had talked about, everything we had in common, wasn't even real. She had tailored everything she said to match what I liked, what I wanted to hear. She had been studying me, trying to become someone who I would be attracted to. She had been using my life, my interests, as part of her web of lies. At that point, I was stunned. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of twisted game, like I was the last piece of her puzzle, and once she had me, she would have completed her mission. But it didn't stop there. When I told her that I didn't think I could continue, that I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine, she panicked. She completely broke down in front of me. She begged me not to leave. "If you leave me," she said, "I'll never be real again." The desperation in her voice sent chills down my spine. It was like she was on the edge of losing herself completely, like the person she had built up could crumble away if I walked out that door. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about her entire identity. If I left, she said, she wouldn't know who she was anymore. I didn't know how to respond. I had never been in a situation like this before, and I couldn't even begin to understand what was going through her mind. I sat there feeling suffocated by the weight of it all. It wasn't just a bad date anymore. It was something much darker. A person so deep in their own lives that they couldn't find their way back to who they really were. I made an excuse to leave. I didn't want to deal with the aftermath of what I had just heard. I couldn't. I stood up, told her I wasn't ready to continue, and walked out, not looking back. My mind was racing. What had just happened? What kind of person would go so far to pretend to be someone else? I never heard from Grace again. I don't know what happened to her after that, but I can't stop thinking about her words. "If you leave me, I'll never be real again." It haunts me. The fear in her eyes, the desperation to be someone else, to be loved, even if it meant losing herself completely. I never understood how deep someone could get into their own web of lies until I met her.